Well, good afternoon to you. 407 here, News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we're making sense of the news. Coming up on the program today, Mary Margaret Olohan joins us from the Daily Wire. We'll talk about the transgender issue in the American military. How extensive is this problem in the military? And to what extent is the Biden administration lying about it? We'll talk about that with Mary Margaret. And then coming up at 5 o'clock, we'll be joined by a 16-year-old high school student who just joined the Republican State Central Committee in Virginia, the chairman of the Virginia High School Republicans, Kellen Habibalehi, there we go, who will be with us. We'll find out what the kids are up to when it comes to politics. And you can join us, as always, at 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. Forget the kids for a moment. What are the commies in China up to, the Chi-Coms? Well, according to the Washington Free Beacon, there's an organization, a group, that's led by former CCP officials that has been quietly funding America's, quote, climate research. According to filings obtained by the Washington Free Beacon, the man who obtained those filings, Thomas Catenacci, joins us now. Tom, great to have you back on the show, sir. Merry Christmas.
Great to be here, Vince. Thanks for having me. Merry Christmas to you as well.
So what did you discover here about the Chinese Communist Party and its meddling in the so-called climate agenda in America?
Yeah, well, first of all, just to kind of lay the groundwork here, as you are aware and as your listeners are aware, intel agencies in the U.S. have been warning for years that the Chinese Communist Party uses different avenues, creative ways, financial incentives to influence policy in the U.S. And so with that sort of backdrop, there's this group, it's called the Energy Foundation China. It's, for all intents and purposes, according to the filings that we've obtained, it's based in Beijing. It leases offices in Beijing, and its staff is actually all located in Beijing. And on top of that, its staff is comprised of all of these former Chinese Communist Party officials, led by its CEO, Ji Zhao, who was a deputy director of the China National Development and Reform Commission.
So let me just make sure I have can I get? Yeah. I just want to get the basics correct here, just so I understand them. This is considered a nonprofit according to American tax law. In other words, they're not a for-profit entity. People who make contributions to this organization do so with a tax benefit, and they are actually operating entirely out of Beijing.
Precisely. And I would encourage actually your listeners not to just divert to our site, but I would really encourage your listeners to read our story, because we go in depth and have a ton of different quotes and color from experts, including former U.S. ambassadors and really high experts, I would say, in this field, saying that this group found a significant tax loophole to essentially pretend that it's a U.S. nonprofit, while all of its operations, according, again, to the filings that we obtained, all of its operations based out of Beijing. And so that kind of leads to the story here, which is they are funding the Department of Energy's Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. And the National Labs, the National Lab Network in the U.S. is this very sort of high-end research apparatus that we have. So advanced technology, a lot of climate research. And what the Energy Foundation is doing is funding that climate research that is happening right here in the U.S., despite all of its ties to the Chinese Communist Party, to the Chinese government. And the way that funding is then spread is to these studies, for example, about the benefits for the Chinese economy and for Chinese jobs that green energy development globally presents. And then this one is just hubris. In November, they funded a guide, a Department of Energy, again, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab guide for transitioning the U.S. grid to green energy dependence. So it's this technical guide that if you didn't look closely at the financial funding behind this guide, you would think it's just a U.S. government technical guide to controlling the power grid and making sure that there's stability. But it's really being funded by this group with every incentive in the world to push the U.S. towards green energy,
Well,
China reaps the benefits of that
Well,
policy.
but in other words, like when you say green energy, what I hear you saying is inefficient energy sources that will not provide America's energy needs. Meanwhile, China has shown no interest whatsoever in converting to so-called green energy. Last I heard, they were building something like 2 large coal power plants every week, and they're not putting up, a bunch of solar panels and windmills, right?
Absolutely. Now, this is the key point here, and it can't be stressed enough. 95% of new coal plants globally are built in China. China accounts for more than half of the world's coal consumption, which is staggering, considering how much coal the entire world consumes. Most of it is in China. And then on top of that, to your first point there, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, which is a grid watchdog, a nonpartisan grid watchdog. Basically, their entire mandate is just to monitor for reliability issues across the country here in the U.S. And they recently put out their annual report a couple weeks ago saying that 2/3 of the country is at risk of severe regular blackouts and brownouts because of this quick transition to green. So while China gets to build all the solar panels and wind turbines and electric vehicle batteries, they're also building more coal than anyone else. And the U.S. is kind of buying into this whole narrative, obviously, buying all of that manufactured technology in China, and now our grid is suffering because of it.
It's amazing. And I'm thinking about all the ways China comes into contact with this. So all the microchips that we have inside of all of these data centers in the United States that are drawing massive amounts of energy from the grid are made in Taiwan, right? And this is of course what China is interested in taking over. And then meanwhile they're encouraging us and the rest of the Western world, especially, to handicap itself and to not pursue the kind of energy that has made humanity thrive. And it also seems like they're kind of hoarding the world's coal for themselves. So if they encourage all of their competitors to get off of reliable energy sources, that means there's going to be a lot more abundant, available, cheap energy for China. Am I missing anything?
No, I would just add that the malicious part of this is the information warfare angle, which is, that's what my story is focused on, is how the Chinese government really smartly uses these types of groups and financial incentives to encourage from within the U.S. this ideology that is clearly hurting us. So you really summed it up perfectly there. But then on top of it, they're actually infiltrating our institutions and capturing our institutions to continue to push this.
So here's something I want to explore with you. Right now, the United States government looks really closely at, or at least they're supposed to, at foreign investment in the United States in the private sector. And they've got CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. That's the whole thing. Is anybody looking into foreign investment into U.S. government agencies? What you just described is a money laundering scheme from the Chinese Communist Party into the federal government of the United States, the Department of Energy. Is anyone looking at this?
Well, I'm looking at it. I know that there are a few reporters out there that are looking into it, but my opinion is it's not enough if it's just members of the media that are looking into this stuff. And I would highly encourage the incoming Trump administration to close these loopholes and to really get out ahead of this type of foreign funding. I mean, there was a separate story that I recently worked on also about how some of the groups that are, forming the coalitions to oppose Doug Burgum's nomination and other top energy nominees' confirmation, they're being funded by foreign sources. And so until we get the foreign funding out of these types of issues, and especially when it's direct funding, right, to the Department of Energy itself for climate research, until we do that, how can we ever trust the information that we're being given? Because there's always that risk that, there's some sort of infiltration or some type of influence that we can't see on the surface.
It's amazing. And so the lesson from all of this, you talked about the information warfare, the energy consumption. it does seem like China is sort of grooming the United States using its own money to self-sabotage. Like they're conditioning their adversary to disarm itself, especially from cheap, abundant energy.
Absolutely. That is certainly my opinion. And now my reporting, I try not to let my opinion come in, but I'm very clear about where my biases are. I mean, when you look at this information, it's hard not to be biased. I would question any reporter who's not biased when they see, CCP officials funding significant climate research in the government. This group is also involved in nonprofits and think tanks in the U.S.
Yes.
But yeah, I would seriously question any reporter who's not curious about that.
And when you say that the Energy Foundation, which of course this is our conversation, Thomas Catenacci is with us, is about this nominally American nonprofit organization called the Energy Foundation. It operates entirely out of Beijing. It's contributing directly to the United States Department of Energy money to pay for its activities. When you mentioned that there's all these so-called former Chinese Communist Party officials, my understanding of, and all the stories we've covered about China, if you're somebody who has this kind of power in China, even if you are a, quote, former Communist Party official, typically what that means is you're doing the bidding of the Communist Party.
Yeah, 100%. And, I can guarantee you, this doesn't even have to be said, but if you were to question these individuals about their loyalty, there's no doubt that they would be loyal to the Chinese government before they're ever loyal or even think about being loyal to the United States government or the United States Constitution. And the reason why we say ex-CCP is because there's no way to really prove that they're current CCP, but we know for sure that they were ex-CCP having these high senior positions in the Chinese government.
Yeah. And there's no way that the Communist Party would allow them to exert influence in the United States and give money to the United States Department of Energy were they not explicitly given the blessing. I think that's a safe assumption for us to make, even without the explicit reporting to back it up.
Yeah, of course. And I actually wanted to just highlight one of these individuals who works currently at the Energy Foundation. Her name is Yunfei Jing, and her previous role was with the China Machinery Energy Corporation. Now, that's a lot of words, but basically with this agency, this Chinese government agency, and what her job at that agency was to spread Chinese influence in developing countries through energy infrastructure. This is what's known as the Belt and Road Initiative, and it's the way China seeks to spread its influence all across the country and really build itself as a substantial adversary to U.S. influence on the world stage. So she was responsible. She was out there building coal plants, gas plants all across the world in nations that needed it, with the intent of making sure that China is considered a superpower or develops into a superpower. And now she is involved with giving money to climate research in the United States. I mean, it's remarkable when you just frame it that way and see the way that our institutions are being captured by people whose entire career has been devoted to increasing Chinese influence.
Yes. Look, here's what I'm here to tell everybody. When people in Washington start taking this story more seriously, they're going to be reading Thomas Catenacci's reporting into the congressional record. So you were here back when it was just a few of us who knew about it. Tom Cat, thank you, as always, for your work and for just the wonderful Washington Free Beacon. Love the whole thing. Thank you very much, sir.
Of course.
All right, coming up on the program, speaking of China, I do want to get into the Wuhan lab leak. I know, it was all those years ago. All of a sudden, there's a great piece today on the subject in the Wall Street Journal on all of the ways that Biden officials have been working to cover up the lab leak and to help China out. Oh, we don't want any of this to reflect poorly upon China. We'll get into that. And also coming up, we'll have Mary Margaret Olohan with us from the Daily Wire. A lot to discuss with her. In particular, the American military. There's been some sort of claim out of leftist organizations and Biden administration affiliated allied groups. They say that there are 15,000 transgender troops in the American military. 15,000 of them. Now, veterans, active duty service members, are you seeing that? 15,000? Seems like a lot of people. That's quite a few high schools, populations of people in the military. Transgender, 15,000? Like, what has happened to the military? 50, that's a lot of people. Uh-huh. Well, we'll dig into the numbers with Mary Margaret Olohan in a moment. She's interested, as we are, in the truth, which is why she'll deliver some coming up here in mere moments on the Vince Coglianese Show. Stay with us. Hey, good afternoon to you. It's 4:35 now. News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we're making sense of the news. Coming up on the program, top of the hour, Kellen Habib Alehi will be with us. He's the chairman of the Virginia High School Republicans, member of the State Central Committee. We'll talk to him about what the high schoolers are up to when it comes to America's political scene. You can join us at 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. Remember, it wasn't that long ago where we got a chance to listen to Joni Ernst, Senator Joni Ernst, talking about, Republican, about what transgender troops contribute to the military. Here's what she told PBS. I believe this was earlier this year. Take a listen to this clip.
So the example of transgender people serving in our military, we have transgender people serving in our military. They will bleed red just as the rest of us. But I also take a stance that we should not be integrating transgender people into certain situations where it does make, if you have a female barracks and you have a transgender woman who has not transitioned, we shouldn't make the rest of the unit uncomfortable about that setting. There are certain accommodations we can make for that transgender individual. But if they bring value to our unit, if they have specialties that we can use, especially if we want to maintain an all-volunteer force, we want to bring that talent into our services. And I know that's controversial, but again, I'm looking at what's good for our nation. And believe me, when we're facing a recruiting challenge right now, if people are physically willing and able to serve our country, we want them to do so.
We have a recruitment challenge, said Senator Joni Ernst. We need all the transgender people we can possibly get. What? Just how many transgender people are even in the military? Well, the number that has been bandied about by the left recently is 15,000. Is that true? Here to explain what she's discovered on this subject is Mary Margaret Olohan. She's a senior reporter for the Daily Wire and the author of D-Trans, True Stories of Escaping the Gender Ideology Cult. Mary Margaret, great to have you back with us. Merry Christmas to you.
Hello and Merry Christmas. Great to be back.
Okay, so Joni Ernst says, look, we've got such a recruitment problem. We definitely need transgender people to join the military. 15,000 are in the military? Where does that number come from?
Well, it's pretty interesting to hear Joni Ernst saying that, because that's also what these very far left organizations like the Human Rights Campaign, the ACLU, are all trying to say. And they cite this 15,000 number, which I found super interesting because I saw this number a couple months ago when the left was saying, if we get rid of our trans-identifying troops, we're going to be facing some kind of military crisis. And I said to my boss, Brent Scher, there's no way that number is real. And so we started doing some digging, and turns out it's just a number that these pro-transgender groups came up with years ago, I might add, back in 2014, based on data from 2008. And they've been touting that number for over a decade now, which is insane. And a lot of the time, what's even more insane is that these pro-transgender groups and these leftist media outlets don't bother to even cite their sources. So you'll see one of these outlets, let's say Newsweek, talking about how there's as many as 15,000 trans-identifying troops. And you go look and there isn't even a link. So I asked two of these groups, I asked the Human Rights Campaign and another lefty group, where are you getting this from? And they both sent me the same study, which is from 2014. And that leads me to believe, Vince, that they're all using the same study, the same numbers, because they don't have anything better to base their claims on. And the fact of the matter is that the number of trans-identifying troops is actually much, much lower. However, we should still probably be concerned because they're getting taxpayer-funded transgender reassignment surgeries, and then they're just hanging out in the military in safe places because they can't be deployed to a war zone if they're recovering from a double mastectomy or something worse.
Yeah. I mean, has the United States military provided any data to you on this?
So we asked many, many times. I spent a good chunk of my week last week asking the DOD, asking Army, Navy, all of these branches of the military, how many trans-identifying troops they had. And what's very interesting is they would not tell me, and they told me, and keep in mind, we're talking about Biden's DOD, which talks about transgenderism and LGBTQ and DEI all the time. They told me, we don't track that, and we don't reveal that information.
Bull.
Which I found, I found it pretty laughable.
It's bull.
It's
the United States military. They track every little thing about the members of the military. They know if you're married. They know if you're single. They know what your tattoos are. It's every element of your life. You turn over to the United States military, and they say they don't have any data whatsoever on if you are delusional about your sex.
Yeah, exactly. Like, for example, the Navy said the Navy does not collect transgender information for reporting purposes. So what they're saying is we know purposes. In some cases, but we're not going to reveal it. And I think the reason for that is we did some more digging and we found out that under Joe Biden's administration, they, of course, reversed Trump's policy and started allowing trans-identifying military members again. But they also messed with rules around reporting this information on them because they said it was discriminatory for the public to know how many trans-identifying troops are.
What?
And at the end of the day,
why would it be discriminatory? I thought this was something to celebrate. Why wouldn't they be bragging about the numbers? Why is it a problem to list this out?
Well, a couple of reasons. I think the optics are terrible because, you can't really have it both ways. You want to say there's 15,000 trans-identifying troops, but then if you want to also say that there's 15,000 troops that are undergoing whatever surgeries they please on the taxpayer's dime, that's not good optics. No. So I think they've found themselves in a little bit of a conundrum here. And, I talked to a bunch of different people who explained to me that, these are former military veterans who told me they do know that there are people who identify as transgender in the military, and the number has risen, but there's no way that there's 15,000. I know. And the point of wielding a number like that is, if you were to ban this from the military, you would debilitate it. So it's a form of sort of like national security, moral blackmail or something. I can't precisely put my finger on what you would call that. But it's meant to say, how dare you suggest that men can't be women, and if they're of that delusion, that they somehow shouldn't serve in the military. And so you stay out of this is really what that statistic means. And it reminds me of, remember years ago there was this, everyone was using the statistic that Americans use 500 million straws a day. Do you remember that? Plastic straws. It was, yes. Everybody was using the same number, 500 million plastic straws. First of all, how does a nation of just over 300 million people use 500 million plastic straws a day? Just a very basic sort of tire kick on that question. And then it turns out, so everybody had cited that number. USA Today, CNN, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, Fox News, The New York Times. Everybody's using 500 million plastic straws a day. Finally, a reporter chased down the number. It was a 9-year-old boy in Vermont who literally invented that number. He did some napkin math, and he's like, I think it's 500 million. And the media used it for years, Mary Margaret. And now you're telling me they're doing it again, yet again, unsurprisingly, with so-called transgender troops in the military. 15,000. They all repeat credulously without anybody going back to the source except for you? Yes. And you know what, honestly, I was incredulous when I realized this because I thought, how am I the only person that traced this data back? But it's true. For over a decade, everybody's been citing this and saying that there's 15,000 trans-identifying troops. And I find it particularly crazy because back when this study came out, it should have raised serious alarm bells. In 2014, that they were claiming there were 15,000 trans-identifying troops. Are we serious? And yet this is what's been behind all of these claims for years and years and years. In fact, I talked to this guy, Chris Bray, who's a veteran, and he's got a really interesting Substack where he was talking about a lot of this stuff. And he was telling me the point of doing this, like when you make up a number like this, he called it catastrophizing.
Yes.
He said you make up a number, and then you use the invented number to create a catastrophe that doesn't exist. And the point of that is to make debate impossible. And I think that's exactly what you're talking about with this straw example, where they just made it up and makes debate impossible. It makes it seem like if we take any kind of action against trans-identifying troops in the military, then we will not be prepared if there's any kind of war or if there's any kind of incident that makes us need to defend ourselves. But what's even crazier about this, Vince, is that I was looking through the book of our incoming Secretary of Defense nominee, Pete Hegseth, and he had some really interesting thoughts on all of this, trans troops in the military. He even writes that he talks very extensively about how it makes you undeployable when you undergo these surgeries. And I'm going to keep it PG here because I don't want to be disgusting, but they're very invasive surgeries. They take a long time to recover from. They involve a lot of maintenance. And, he was making a joke, like, you don't really want someone who's recovering from this very invasive surgery to be like in your platoon when you're in a war zone. And not only that, but they can't be there. They're not fit to be there.
Well, in other words, it's a debilitating thing, a debilitating surgical intervention. And in fact, I don't usually do this, but Mary Margaret, if you could hold for a moment, I do have a caller calling in. Mara is in Stafford. Mara, you are on line one. Mara, you're a nurse with DOD?
Yes, I still am a nurse case manager, but I worked at the Quantico Clinic, or the Quantico Navy base, or Marine Corps base, I'm sorry.
Yes.
At the Naval Hospital, and I actually was the IDES LIMDU coordinator, was nurse case manager, and IDES is the Integrated Disability Evaluation System, and limited duty for the Marines. So what also they're not taking into account is once some of these, Marines have transitioned, mostly going from female to male, now they have to pass the PT test under the male standard, and they will be ad-stepped when they fail, which most of them do. Of course, I don't have those statistics as well, but that's another thing that happens too. On top of when they do have the surgeries, and then there are the complications, which I think the nice lady on that you have, your guest, has also brought up. But then they're medically discharged because now they're responsible for them. So now with those complications, tax dollars are going to be spent with their continual medical care until basically death. So
in your experience, the idea of somebody who's, quote, transitioning, returning to regular duty is almost non-existent.
Exactly, because we were getting them like literally right out of AIT. They would show up at Quantico for their first duty station and then all of a sudden announce that they joined the Marine Corps as SAM, but now they want to be SU.
Oh, and so in other words, taxpayers have to cover the entirety of their transition and they never serve any meaningful time in the military.
Absolutely.
Incredible.
Got it. It's Mara, thank you for that. That's a very useful contribution to this conversation. Yeah, so Mary Margaret, it's like you've got overstatement about the extent of the problem, and to the extent that it does exist within the military, you've got people who are exploiting the system in order to, let's face it, hurt themselves, and then not actually serving meaningful time after that happens. And here we are. And you contacted the Pentagon for answers, and their response was, sorry, that's not to be shared in public?
Literally, that is literally what happened. And the fact, too, that, we got to keep in mind, I wrote a whole book on this. People who are trying to undergo these transitions are almost always across the board very mentally ill. So they're already struggling seriously with mental illness and they need help. Yeah. And then they're entering the military. They're let's say they are put in an active war zone or they're, in a tight spot. They need to be prepared and able to handle that situation. And if you're undergoing these hormones, this is messing with your mental state as well. So there's so many factors here that make this not an acceptable situation to be putting their military, colleagues in as well. So the whole thing is insane. And I think, you take a step back and look at it, and most normal people would laugh and say, obviously, that's a bad idea. Obviously, that's a bad use of taxpayer funds. Obviously, that's something that's going to make members of the Army and the military, Army and the Navy and, the Marines furious that they're being placed in this situation. And I know they are because I've talked to a lot of them. Yeah. I know young men who are fathers who just want to serve their country, and they're being put in insane positions, whether it's with the COVID vax and the mandates, and now with drag shows on their ships, and then Biden encouraging the transitioning of military members, and then the crazy restrictions they face if they speak out. So, I know a lot of these guys are really excited for Trump to be back in office. And, all of this, I started writing about all of this because a bunch of mainstream outlets started writing and saying that Trump was getting ready to remove trans-identifying troops from the military.
There's one more thing that Mara said that really stands out to me that I want to dwell on for a moment. The fact is, and I think she was referring to the Marines specifically, that you have all these women who came in who said they want to transition to become men. And then the Marine Corps said, fine, we'll treat you as men and hold you to the male standard for physical fitness in the military. And apparently they wash out as a result of that, because in reality, they're women. And I don't know. I don't know whose thought that was in the Marine Corps. Maybe it was some Marine who was like, "Look, fine. If we have to live under this world, you're going to be treated to the male standard." I don't really know, but boy, it is amazing, isn't it? That's even happening.
It is, and right, and of course we know that would happen. Any rational person from the outside looking at that would say, "Well, she's a woman, so she's not going to be able to meet the male standards." But unfortunately, Vince, a lot of these women are mentally ill. They think that transitioning is a magic thing that makes them men because they're mentally ill, and they don't have the proper guidance from real doctors and therapists who will say, no, actually you're a woman and you're not going to have the physical fitness abilities of a man. So this is all a mess. It needs to be turned around. And I think, Trump hasn't officially said what he's planning on doing, but I think a lot of us can guess. So here's to 2025, right?
Yeah, and anybody who makes a wise decision is going to be informed by reporting that you have done. Mary Margaret Olohan, thank you for constantly screaming that the emperor has no clothes. I think hopefully more people will wake up as a result of it. Thank you, and Merry Christmas again. Oh, man. The left is at it again. They're really trying to stop Trump from becoming president. They're angry that the voters chose him. And they're trying to keep this plot alive where the elites in our country just declare that Trump is invalid and therefore can't become president on January 20th. You remember this from Jamie Raskin?
What can be put into the Constitution can slip away from you very quickly. And the greatest example going on right now before our very eyes is Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which they're just disappearing with a magic wand, as if it doesn't exist, even though it could not be clearer what it's stating. And so, they want to kick it to Congress. So it's going to be up to us on January 6, 2025 to tell the rampaging Trump mobs that he's disqualified. And then we need bodyguards for everybody in Civil War conditions, all because the 9 justices, not all of them, but these justices who have not many cases to look at every year, not that much work to do, a huge staff, great protection, simply do not want to do their job.
Well, it's not Jamie Raskin this time, but it's other legal luminaries who are out floating this theory. They want to do what Jamie Raskin just suggested, which is taking the United States Constitution and stuffing into a paper shredder and then lighting the remnants on fire and then saying, see, we're allowed to banish Donald Trump from the Oval Office. No, you're not. No, you're not. We'll get into that and everything else that's going on in the world. Also, we'll be joined in just moments by Kellen Habibulahi. Habibulahi, did I get that right? We'll ask him. He's a young man, 16 years old, involved in Republican politics in Virginia. How's high school going? We'll talk next.